Well, good morning, Crossroads. Skip Nelson, financial advisor, Thrivent Financial, and one of the many volunteers here to bring you Minnesota Crossroads. We are so thrilled that you're joining us. We see people just pouring in. The bell hits 7:30, and everybody's got their coffee. So glad you're coming in. We've got a fantastic morning planned for you. Great information, great resources in your job transition. And I've been through job transition, as of many of us that volunteer at Minnesota Crossroads. And I just wanted to share a couple of words from the Bible related to job transition. And one of the things that I found in my job transition, and really I've coached hundreds of people since, also in job transition, a word that comes to mind is humble. Now, what does that have to do with job transition? Well, the thing that I found that I had started my own company out of college, ran it for almost 30 years, had some success. And I found that kind of my self-worth professionally was defined by my career, by my company. And when I decided to make a career change, that kind of went away. And even though it was by choice, it went away. So a lot of times in job transition, we lose more than a paycheck. We lose camaraderie. We lose feeling needed, and we lose value that we provide in our job. And I know in my transition, I kind of felt useless sometimes. I mean, it was kind of depressing. And but I also found that my ego got in the way, because I had built my company, right? No, God did it. I had accomplished all these things in my career. Well, no, really, God did. But sometimes we think it's us, and we think it's up to us. And when we get into job transition, we have to humble ourselves at some point, when we really need to realize that it isn't up to us. It is God's plan, particularly when maybe the job transition goes longer than we had anticipated, or like certainly than I had it all planned out, right? Well, God's got a different plan. And even though it can be frustrating when his plan maybe doesn't line up with ours, takes longer, whatever, I've seen time and time again, including my own situation, that if you are patient, if you are humble, and you turn it over to God, he has an amazing plan for you, a great job that you can't even imagine. And so that can be challenging, to humble yourself. But remember the word humble, and that you are not in this alone. God has got this, but you need to be humble to turn it over to him. And I'd like to relate James 6-8 that says, God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. Submit yourselves then to God. Come near to God, and he will come near to you. We pray. Kind Heavenly Father, thank you for every person on this call this morning. Thank you for their journey, that you have incredible plans in store for them. Help them to feel your presence and your guidance in this process, Lord, and be with each person to help them feel fulfilled in the process, and bring them to a place that is beyond anything they can imagine. In your kind and heavenly name, amen. Well, we've got, as I mentioned, great morning for you. We're going to be hearing from a gentleman with his testimony that's kind of a blast from the past. This is, we've pulled it out of the archives as far as a testimony, a gentleman by the name of Charlie Schaller. And Charlie actually gave his testimony from the hospital when his wife had just given birth to their child. And talk about commitment to Minnesota Crossroads and giving a testimony. But he's an amazing guy. He's a director at Optum, and actually now just got promoted to chief of staff for the chief medical officer at United Health Group. So pretty impressive guy. So we're going to hear from Charlie and his testimony, and then I will be back to introduce our speaker. So Charlie.
For this, but I am coming to you from the Maple Grove Hospital. 36 hours ago, my wife delivered our fourth son, Ike William Schaller, and so she is full disclosure here, she is supportive of me being here. I would not take this call if she wasn't, and she's just a few doors down in the process of recuperating with our baby. So really grateful for the chance to be here and to speak to a topic that I think for me has been one of the more personal ways God has taught me about himself, and that's through my career and career transitions. And I think in a lot of ways, it's appropriate that I'm here at a birthing and delivery center, because I think in a lot of ways, transitions in our lives are a lot like childbirth. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years down the line, we can kind of look at them with rosy colored glasses and just remember the highlights and when key events happened and the first smile, the first sleeping through the night. But as someone who's now back in the midst of the first week of life with a baby, I can tell you it is chaotic, it is unnerving, it is discombobulating. And during this process, I've had to remind myself that there's great meaning and great purpose at the end of the tunnel, and therefore the sleeplessness is worth it, and the tiredness is worth it, and the diapers are worth it. And that may be an odd parallel to draw, but I feel like for a lot of us, when we go through transitions in life, it's a very rare day that they make sense in the moment. And so I'd like to take you to a time in my life where I walked through a significant period of upheaval, with the hopes that potentially if you're walking through a similar period, you may be able to draw a similar hope and a similar perspective that 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 months, years, weeks, maybe even down the line, what could be viewed as a very chaotic time would be viewed with faith, and also through the lens of God being able to work even in the midst of craziness. At times, maybe even him choosing to work in it rather than through calm. So I work for Optum, which is a part of United Health Group. So specifically, I'm Senior Director for Business Planning in our Strategic Partnerships Group, which means I get to do a lot of really cool stuff, specifically around leveraging emerging technology for transforming healthcare. So everything from using AI to predict the spread of influenza and COVID, to asking how could we keep seniors in their houses longer through connected devices, mesh Wi-Fi, ambient computing, all these kind of cool words you see on the news. I love it. It uses my passions. It's extremely meaningful for me. 5 years ago, I was in a job that I loved, I was passionate about, I used my skills and was extremely meaningful to me as well. The time of that transition, that was a very meaningful and significant time, time that actually didn't make a lot of sense to us, my wife and I. So since college, I'm an undergrad from the Carleton School of Management. I worked with Campus Crusade for Christ, or CREW. My wife and I joined straight out of college. We worked together, which was a huge blessing. Had the chance to work with and enjoy working with my wife for about 10 years straight. And we were in a period of self-selected transition. We had been offered a position as kind of a senior leadership over New York City. So we were going to head out to New York. We were going to have a huge city strategy to kind of develop our operations in this massive metropolitan area. We had told all of our friends, we told all of our parents, we'd announced to the groups that we were leading, we had selected our successors and had kind of a public handover. The only gap was I was in the process of getting my MBA. When we were offered this position in New York, it made sense. I had said I really want to develop my leadership skills a bit more on the quant side. Specifically, I was asking questions like, could we finance the purchasing of an apartment building that would make it cheaper for people to move into the city so that they wouldn't want to live 2 hours away, and we could really have a lot of our staff centered there. Anyways, that made sense to me too. I'd applied to the University of Iowa's MBA program, which was 8 blocks away from our house, and had been accepted with a full scholarship. That was awesome. That made sense. And so we were just in this A through Z, every element of our lives being exciting and scary, but also making a ton of sense. It was over the course of getting my MBA that God started giving us puzzle pieces that didn't make sense. It was like every piece we gotten so far, we knew where it went and it made sense and clicked right into the right spot. And all of a sudden we were, instead of blue puzzle pieces, getting red puzzle pieces. And intuitively, we didn't know where they went. And for both my wife and I, as firstborns and the parents of 2 boys at the time, it was very disconcerting for us to not be exactly sure where these pieces went. Things like, I would love spending time with my classmates. Just, specifically just being able to, interact and love on people from other countries, people who didn't know about my faith, people who I had a chance to really just serve and come alongside, have into our house, stuff that oddly enough in ministry, I didn't have as many opportunities to do. My wife would start saying things like, you're kind of coming home a different guy than you were when you left in the morning. So that's just a piece, right? We didn't know what that meant. That wasn't the puzzle. For us, though, the significant disruption to our plan came in March of 2016. when my dad texted me during class to let me know that my mom was being rushed to the ER with some mysterious rash on her leg that wouldn't go away, but that was spreading. And what we found over the coming weeks was that my mom had been suffering from a type of blood cancer called acute myeloid leukemia, AML, which is not the most aggressive type of blood cancer, but is certainly in the running for one of the worst that a person can get. And for us, the puzzle was not simply disrupted, but destroyed. We were in a position now where we were asking questions, not just what's the best place to live, Upper West Side or Yorktown or in a Battery, but really this question of if my mom is dying, and we don't know if she is, because again, change is chaotic and transition is insane. But if she is, how does that change what God has called us to do? If indeed this plan is being disrupted, why has God allowed us to collect what feels like 50, 60, 70, 80 puzzle pieces that all seem to be pointing us in this one direction? And we started to ask this question of, what does it look like to follow God, to be willing to lay down your life and surrender and walk a path of his will, and then to feel like he has completely uprooted what you think his will is. And so, again, like childbirth, this all makes a lot more sense as I share it today, but for us, it was extremely chaotic. Another significant disruption came when my mom's illness increased, and we reached out to the leadership of our previous organization, Crew, which, by the way, very grateful for, and grateful for the leadership they provided. But they essentially communicated that due to a broad national organization change, that they really didn't have a position for us in Minneapolis. And so the puzzle became even more complicated. The issue now became, well, if we want to be able to either A, spend my mom's last months with her, or B, be there for my dad, it wouldn't just mean a geographical change of plans. It would mean a complete career disruption. And I would say both Abby and I, we saw ourselves as long-termers, being willing to be on staff long-term. And so considering the transition out of, full-time vocational ministry into a completely different career of any kind was incredibly disruptive. And if you're in a career disruption right now, I think my response to that disruption was anger and frustration, a sense of, God, I've been telling people my entire life that if they trust you and they put themselves in your hands, that their life will turn out better than if they hadn't. And I'm not a big fan of the prosperity gospel, but I even understand as I share those things that there were elements of the lie that I believed in that moment. That if I served God, I was free from pain because he owed it to me. And so in the midst of that process, and Dave, I'm going to ask you just to message me when I have 2 minutes left here, we really felt led and called to pursue a job hunt outside of ministry with the same faith principles that we pursued support raising within our ministry. So I was on staff for 12 years with Crew. Every dollar we received as a paycheck through that, we had raised through fund generation. And actually, Grace and several members of the church were valuable members of our team, so there may even be supporters on this call. But we really had to walk into every day as we developed funds for either ourselves or our team or broader initiatives, saying that, God, unless you move, in spite of our education, our experience, in spite of our communication abilities, unless you move, this train doesn't move forward. And so we ask, would you provide our daily bread, right? And he faithfully did over 12 years. But my commitment to support raising in a faith context was that I wanted someone to look at my work and see my faith. That in looking at how I raised support, how I trusted God, how I stepped out and did something that was maybe even kind of countercultural and then strange in terms of raising our own salaries, that people would say, okay, I get it. When we step out and trust God, our faith empowers us to do hard, crazy things, and a lot of them. And so we decided to really run at the career search, not as an opportunity to rapidly end a transitional period that was uncomfortable, but really as a chance to say, God, we believe that you will work through this search. We give you permission to be strange in this time, and we want to learn from you in this. Difficult and incredibly painful for us to say, like, God, we surrender our future state to you. And my future state was living in Manhattan. Awesome. My future state was getting to work with some of my best friends out east. Awesome. My future state was having a grandma who's at my kids, or a mom who's at my kids' weddings. And I think in the midst of the upheaval of not just family structure, geographic structure, but also the very fabric of what I expected life to be, I feel like God called us in a very difficult and very painful way to experience a season of transition that we would not have been able to learn from had the puzzle pieces continued to turn up blue. Long story short, applied for a ton of different positions, decided to stretch myself and say, God, you've already decided not to make sense, so let's let's get crazy here. And ended up landing a terrific position on a terrific team with a technology company called Optum in the Twin Cities. And incredibly meaningful, had the chance to work with brilliant people, had the chance to really further medical advances. So when I think about losing my mom, which unfortunately we did in March of 2017, I had the opportunity through living out my faith at work to influence the lives of others so that there are more moms in the future. And I think sitting here, I'm grateful for the wilderness period of transition. And if I could go back and tell myself one thing, it would be read the Gospels and look how often Jesus contextualizes the kingdom of God in the context of people's occupations. I don't think necessarily the God of Israel is overly focused on fishing and farming. I don't think that he's necessarily obsessed with those topics. And yet he chose time and time again to talk about farmers, shepherds, fishermen, because I think there's a unique part of our souls that God has created us with that resonate with work. And that when we go through periods of transition, it is not a season in which God has chosen to step away or even to punish us, but potentially an opportunity for us to learn more about his character through this heart resonance in terms of our full-time occupations and our livelihood that we wouldn't have the chance to do. And so I think if I could go back 5 years ago, I would have said, Charlie, you get one chance to walk through this. Look for as many opportunities as you can to learn from it. How will God meet you in the morning in uncertainty and frustration and confusion? And what can he teach you there in the valley that he might not even choose to teach you on the mountaintop? And so for someone 5 years later, sleep deprived at a Maple Grove hospital, that's the element that I'm grateful for, and one that I hope would serve as a blessing or encouragement to those of you who are also in a similar search. So Harry, thanks so much for having me, and it's been an honor to speak.
Wow, what a story. Talk about an old one, but a good one. I had not seen that one before, and what an inspiration. So thank you, Charlie. To now your 1-year-old, I would imagine it's probably been about a year ago that happened. So what a plan God's got for all of us, and we just need to lean into it. So on to our speaker. We are so fortunate to have this next gentleman be willing to spend some time with us and offer his message. Dave Sparkman is no stranger to Crossroads. In fact, he was kind of one of the founders of Minnesota Crossroads to get the whole thing off the ground. And now happens to be chairman of the board of the National Crossroads Group. So he knows a thing or two about Crossroads. And but Dave also was a former senior VP at United Health Group and is also currently on the ministry team at Grace Church in Eden Prairie, where we are typically housed when we are in person, which hopefully will be soon. But we are just so thrilled to have Dave back at home at Minnesota Crossroads, and look forward to his message. Good morning, Dave.
Good morning. Thank you, Skip. Really appreciate that. I'm going to share my screen because we're going to jump right into the presentation that you all signed up to hear today on compensation strategies. Grateful to be with all of you here today. Wonderful to hear from Charlie again. Boy, there's so many things that he said that resonate with me and what I went through after I came out of the implosion of Arthur Andersen years ago and eventually landed up at United Health Group, moving from Los Angeles to Minnesota, and then leaving United Health Group in January of 19 and transitioning into a self-employment mode, and then also spending more time with Crossroads Career. And it's quite a change going from a large corporate organization, publicly held company, to a smaller, privately nonprofit organization like Crossroads. But what really fuels my heart is talking about and with people who are in transition. because I remember how many questions went through my mind, very similar to Charlie. And I think so often of Jesus as he talks in scriptures about his kingdom. And as Charlie mentioned, the puzzle pieces just don't fit together. And I've heard it described that Jesus really described his kingdom as an upside down kingdom, where things don't really make sense, really allowing us to see, are we going to follow? Are we going to trust? And so very helpful to hear that again, much resonated. And what I want to talk about today with all of you are compensation strategies. And perhaps similar to what Charlie shared, some of those may not make sense to you. On the other hand, I think you'll hear a number of things that hopefully your heads will be nodding and say, well, yeah, that makes sense. I've heard that before. Like many presentations, I'm hopeful that you'll walk away with a few nuggets that will enable you to do some things differently for you to get different results. Most people think about compensation within a job transition as, well, that's what happens at the end of the process. And you're absolutely correct. You also probably have heard that, it's not good to talk about compensation prior to getting to the end. And that's also correct. But there are many nuances of things you could be doing to ensure or enhance is probably the better word of getting a compensation level that you're aiming toward and managing your own expectations along with that, with what is happening in the marketplace. So we're going to jump into that. I've got about 8 steps to go through that I'm suggesting would be useful to you as you go through a transition. And some of this applies to whether you're employed or unemployed. So I'm hopeful that we have both audiences here today that can benefit from something I have to say. But to get started, we're going to play with your brain a little bit. In the next slide, you're going to see a host of images, and I'd like you to try and gather in as many images as you possibly can in about 2 seconds. So if you're focused on this screen, be looking very closely because here it comes. And there it goes. So if we were all together, I'd be asking you, well, what did you see? If you're an audience like most audiences, you probably were able to see 1, 2, maybe even up to 4 items that you could identify. And we would go through and ask you what were those items? And we'd start to see how many people saw the same thing. So how many of you saw a monkey? And we'd ask you to raise your hands. How many of you saw a wedding couple? Oh, we'd ask you to raise your hands. How many of you saw money? We'd ask you to raise your hands. Well, what you would quickly gather is that not everyone sees the same thing. For some unknown reason, in that myriad of about 40 different objects in that collage, not everyone sees the same thing. If we asked a different question, if we were able to utilize what everyone saw and piece it together in a puzzle, do you think we would fill in a lot of the blanks of what was in that collage? The answer is yes. If we tap into the wisdom of the team, if we get more people's perspectives, we're going to see things a bit differently. Well, now I'd like you to look at this screen. I'm going to show you the exact same collage of objects. And this time, I want you to look for something yellow. All right. Now, if we went through and asked you, you may say, well, I saw the yellow flower. I saw the Hummer, or I saw the rubber duck. And the follow-on question is, well, did you see those things the first time? Maybe, maybe not. But if we said, well, why do you think you saw those things? And the answer is very simple. Because, Dave, you asked us to look for something yellow. So our eyes, our brains go right into the request, and they start to see things that we maybe didn't previously see. Almost every single time, in fact, 100% of the time when I asked people, did they see at least one object that they had not seen before in the previous 2 seconds that they had, every hand would go up. Because now that we're more focused, you're getting a second chance. You may have revisited the area of the screen or the slide that you were looking at before and you saw something that wasn't yellow, but something else. So what's the object of this brief exercise? The object is that once we're fine-tuned into something and we're looking for something, and just for your curiosity, I know some of you are going, I didn't see the Hummer. I got to see the Hummer. Okay, here's the screen. You can look to your heart's content as to what's there. Inevitably, when we become focused and use a common lens, we're going to see something different. If I had asked you to look for something red, you would have seen the lighthouse or the strawberry or the rose, right? Our eyes and our brains work that way. Well, what I'm asking you to do today is to look through a different lens when you think about compensation. Instead of just thinking, oh, I'm only supposed to talk about it to the end, or, oh, I hope they don't ask me about my salary range, I'd like you to shift that lens to something different. And I'm hopeful that as we go through this today, I'm going to provide you various lenses that you can look through to enable you some practical advice as to how to look at compensation that ultimately will benefit your bottom line. So that was one exercise. And of course, now we have a little quiz. If we were all together or had our chat room that we were active on, we would start to ask you some questions. But again, due to time, due to our the way we're going through this venue, we're going to just fill in the blanks. The unemployment rate today is 3.6% in the United States. And if you go through all of these other questions, which we won't take the time to do, and we could debate the source of the answers. Somebody may have seen 3.5% or 3.7%. July is released, I think, this morning. We're going to get different answers, but generally, it's going to be something that we can align around as far as an answer. If we were about 2 years ago at the start of the pandemic and we asked, what was the unemployment rate? Well, back in April, it was 11.4%. We're in a very, very different climate today than we were 2 years ago. Oh, and then you have to start to think about what's the forecast? Well, is it the big R word of recession or not? Well, depending on what definition you take and who's making that definition, we could have different answers. But ultimately, you're in a place where you're seeking out what's the next step, what's the next position or area that you're going to work in. I agree with Charlie. I don't think God is overly concerned about fishing or tradesmen or being an accountant. But I do believe he is very interested in why do we do the work that we do? And are we trusting him to guide us into that place? And I think not only the place, but also what are we paid? How are we reimbursed for the talents that we contribute to that job is something that if we use our brains and our trust with him, we will end up in a different place. I do want you to look at that last bullet point if you haven't gotten there already. True or false? I know exactly what I want to make and that my market value corresponds to the number. If you actually can say true to that, you're one of the few people I've encountered in my over 16 years of working with Crossroads that actually know the answer. In fact, when I was unemployed and looking for the next gig, I didn't know the answer. I knew what I thought I would want or what I thought I was worth, but I didn't know exactly. I was talking to a good friend yesterday whose son is looking to potentially, explore the opportunity with another company. And he threw out the number that this young man was thinking about getting. And I said, well, what's the basis for that number? No idea. Again, 99.9% of the time, most people don't really have the basis for the number that they're looking at. What I would suggest that you do is put on a different lens. And by the end of this presentation, you're going to have some facts to put together, not maybe exactly, but a very solid range with solid rationale as to what you believe you're worth and how you can go about trying to get that number. So, hit a couple of these already, but the one I want to focus on is bullet point number 2. Do you know the land that you're hunting in? A number of years ago, I started hunting white-tailed deer. And what I learned is that yes, you can go sit in a tree stand and tromp out there, sit in the stand, hopefully shoot something, tromp back, have a wonderful time with friends, but you may not get a deer. But if you start to scout the land, if you start to pay attention to what is the environment that you're in, something as simple as, are we in a drought or not? Well, that will tell you about deer movement. What are the food sources available to the deer? Oh, and by the way, the food sources change during the hunting season itself. If you're a bow hunter, that their patterns of movement will be dictated by what food sources are around. You can start to look at whether it's the breeding season for deer or not, and they're going to behave differently. Well, taking that analogy into your job search, do you understand the climate that you're in, the landscape that you're hunting in? And if you're looking along the way, you're going to see some things that will help you in that negotiation. And ultimately, everything is a negotiation. You may choose not to engage in that negotiation or not, as some people do. Everyone has a little different style, and that's okay. But to go through the due process to where you can feel comfortable at the end of that discussion, having accepted an offer and you feel good about what you're being paid, that's ultimately where we're trying to take you today. And that's going to require, I believe, a little shift in your thinking, a few new lenses to look at the collage, to look at the landscape in a different way. So that's the introduction. That's the context for what we're getting into. Let's jump right into some of the things we're going to go after. We're going to hit these 8 areas and a few slides on each. I'm going to try and keep moving. We're going to try and land the plane with some time for questions that you may have at the end, so we can get real time to ensure that you're walking away with value from today. But this is what we're going to go after. So let's look at that timing targets that based on finances. And I lead with this one for a very simple reason. If you have no money and you need money right away, you may have to jump into something that is not what your target is. So if you look at this particular slide, I want to explain it to you just a tad. I'm going to see if I can move this over a bit so you don't see me as much. A job seeker that I was working with actually put this together for me as we were walking through the process. He said, well, really, the center of my bullseye are these particular companies. And I said, okay, that's great. It's terrific to have a target. It's great to know what you're aiming for. But if you look at 2 and 3 and 4, the outer rings of the bullseye, he has other alternatives that he could go after. Well, if the target number 1 doesn't work, I could always do consulting. I could do an adjunct professor teaching. I might go to work for the government. In his case, those were not the top targets. Those were number 2. Well, and if those don't work, I could even look at some internships and some contract work. And if that doesn't work, I could go, that's his expanding target list. With that, if you go over to the far right, the little table, he had said, well, if I'm shooting for target number 1, here's the timeline that I'm working after. He did have some severance that he could work through. He had some savings that he could work through. So he said, just roughly every few months, I'm going to expand my search outside that target. So as long as the number 1 is there, I'm going to stay focused on the target. But once June 1st comes, I'm going to potentially expand that target and use round 2 of the target as a stepping stone type of position. I'm going to go to a stopgap. I'm going to have that conversation with his wife in this case. So, honey, we may be doing something different here, going to a nonprofit. So this was his analogy of what we're looking at with time-based milestones. You may have completely different targets and things within that the outer rings. What I would encourage you to do is put a little bit of time in looking at what are your targets and what's the time frame. If you are going to lose your house because the mortgage payments aren't being made, you may have to jump into something right away just to get cash flow and demonstrate to the bank that, hey, you're going to work with them and you're viable to make those payments. If you have a year's worth of severance or savings and you can afford to do that, this is number 1, because to me it is need based. I may think I'm worth $100,000, But if I need cash right away, I may have to settle for something different. I may have to use that as a stepping stone. I may have to say, so Carrie, we've got to look at something a little bit different. So number one is look at what your time-based milestones are. And I'd encourage you to do this up front before you become emotionally engaged in whatever it is you're chasing. I was talking to a job seeker just last week, and he had been looking for about a month. I'd conversed with this fellow several times, and he had hit an interview that went exceptionally well. And it was with some people that he really liked. I mean, he thought this was going to turn into something. You can probably fill in the blanks. It didn't progress. You know, he got feedback from the recruiter. Well, people are out of town. We can't get these people to coalesce. Oh, we're seeing more candidates. I mean, it just keeps dragging on and dragging on. Well, meanwhile, he had kind of settled that he was the guy and hadn't been networking, hadn't been going after things the way he could have. Well, he now had to adjust his milestone. His cash had changed, and now he had to adjust his target. So a lot of factors at work here, but for you to get an objective, upfront perspective, which no matter where you are in your search is today's as good as any day to do something like this, to say, where am I, where am I going, and what's the framework? Let's go forward. Number two, many people get some pesky questions. They hate these questions. Well, what is your compensation expectation? What exactly is the range you're looking for? You don't like answering those questions. You don't want to get involved in it. Understandably, you don't want to price yourself out of what the range is that may be there for the job that you're applying for, because most of the time, excuse me, you may not know what that range is, but you got to give them an answer. And we're going to get to what your answer could be, but I want to make sure you understand why, because if a recruiter brings me, when I was back at United Health Group, a candidate, and we didn't flush out that that candidate fit within the range that we had budgeted to pay that candidate, that recruiter wasn't going to be with United Health Group very long. They need to find out this information. So it's kind of, hey, pass go and you get your $200. So you have to give them an answer. So it's best that you get prepared for that. Number three, you do have to give them the information in number two, but you want to never get into a discussion around compensation until the end of the interviewing process, when they say they not only want you, but we're going to talk about how we want them to love you. And if you go to Cold Stones, you know that they have another one where you gotta have it level, which is a much bigger cup. Well, that's what we're trying to get you toward as you go through this process, where the company that you're talking to, the organization, not only likes you and says they want you, but they love you and they gotta have you. That's where you really want to be. Until then, you want to hold off on those questions on compensation. It's premature. Well, here's some of the rationale in that. If I said, I'm a former accountant, a former CPA, and if I was going to be an accounting manager, or a controller at a certain company, well, the controller at United Health Group at corporate makes a lot more than a controller at the tire distribution store. Okay, a small business controller makes different money than a large business controller most of the time. Those responsibilities are different. The scope is different. Even within a large company, it will vary. So you may talk to United Health Group, Medtronic, General Mills. You could have fairly different scopes of what you're responsible for. Now, they're going to have compensation surveys that they've done, so they're going to have some fairly scientific data to price that at, but they're still going to be different. So you don't want to get into discussions until you find out what exactly are they expecting of you, all right? So you want to hold off on that. And that answer I have here, I'll get to that. Could you help me understand the job is where I'm going with that second bullet point. Always easy to talk about the range, going to number two. You have to give them a range most of the time, or you do not pass go, you don't go forward. The question that I get many times is, well, I have erratic compensation. Or sometimes people say, look, I know I was in a very good spot. I'm not even looking for that level of compensation. I just need a job. I want something I'm willing to accept 10% less of what I was making, 20% less or whatever it was. Shouldn't I tell them that up front? No, not necessarily. You want to stick to the script, give them a range, because you want to continue to get a lay of the land. You want to continue to gather information through the process, and it gets involved in even in the networking process. You can start to gather information so that when an offer does come, you're able to answer. So when do you discuss comp? They've seen you at your best. You get to know them. And this is one, if you go into some of the resources on our website, we pose some questions for you to ask. In fact, our blogs over the months of June and July, I wrote some blogs about how do you know if you're a cultural fit at the organization? And we give you 8 steps to go through to give you some clues as to what that entails. And what I find out many, many times in the thousands of people that I've interviewed is they don't really ask that many questions. I understand that. You're trying to get the offer. You don't want any barriers to be there. But if you're like me and you've worked at a company where you were not a good corporate fit, even a good cultural fit, even though the compensation was good, it's miserable. You don't want to be there. So you want to fit, you want to be at a place where you're valued and where you add value. And part of that adding that equation then is being compensated appropriately. So some of these bullets here, what I've already mentioned, what does the job entail? How well do you fit? You're in the final interview. You've determined that you really want to work there, all right? And I hit the we want you, we've got to have you. So that's when you want to discuss compensation more fully, is true to the adage of wait until the end, but we're going to come back to how you get that range. Now, a lot of people get very frustrated with the process. If you put yourself, step outside of the position of a job seeker, and most of you have been with an employer, most of you have probably hired people, you're trying to get the person in for as little as you possibly can, right? It's like any negotiation. I mean, do I really want to pay top dollar for whatever product it is that I'm purchasing? Well, no, not really. I'd rather pay the bottom line price that I could, but I don't want to be a cheapskate. And I kind of have a habit of being, I like to say I'm frugal, but okay, I don't want to be a cheapskate. I'm willing to pay for value. And what you're trying to go through that process and do is demonstrate that value, that you are the right person for that role. If you come across as desperate, because I just got to have a job, and you haven't gone through step 1 of looking through the timing, that will come through. All of you, all of us make first impressions. And it's amazing. You may think that you can hide some things in those first impressions. You know, human beings are human beings. It just comes out, right? You may think that you don't have a negative attitude, but in the midst of the conversation, it could come out that you have a grudge against your past employer for whatever reason. I saw that quite a bit. And so to work through the process of ensuring your attitude is under control, you know, making sure your aptitudes are coming out more fully, working through those bullet points where they can see you at your best, that's what you're willing to do, wanting to do, so they'll pay the most for you. So number 5, part of it is also doing some homework of what exactly do you need? We're going to come to this on a number that you should be able to talk about is what's your monthly budget? What's your annual budget? These are just some of the areas that you may spend the money on. If I say, well, I deserve that 100,000 and I only really need 20,000 to survive, well, that's a big range with what I think I need or I want or deserve and what I really truly need. It's not to say that I should settle for 20 grand to survive, but to know the numbers are very, very important. And I'm saying that not just because I'm a former accountant, it's part of the process we're going to get to in a moment to look at the 5 numbers that you need to know. You also could do some searching for what are typical salaries for your field. What is the data worth? Well, in today's age, right, with wonderful Amazon, we can kind of very quickly see and cross shop for a lot of different things. If only they were the Amazon within the job salaries. I know Harry is sitting there as an experienced recruiter going, boy, that could be on one level probably pretty good, on another level potentially a disaster. But trying to figure out what you're worth, and you're going to need to talk to some people. You can look and find some information online. We'll get to that in the next slide. But to talk to people and start to gather information, sometimes maybe a little bit uncomfortable, because most people, hey, what do you make? That's not exactly the way to approach it. But as you're networking, I'll hit on that last point, you're going to start to see some patterns. And I'm not suggesting that you ask the question, well, what do you make? But you may say, for example, hey, at United Health Group, if you're networking with someone from United Health Group, how do you feel about how your compensation is handled at United Health Group? And they may say, oh, I feel it's very fair. Or they may say, well, no, all the senior people get all the money and all of us nurses don't, or whatever it may be. You're going to glean information to get a feel for what that landscape looks like at United Health Group. And then you network with someone from General Mills, and then you network with somebody from Joe's Body Shop, and then you network with, you're going to start to get a flavor. Obviously, if you're trying to get an hourly wage, that's a different process than a salaried employment. And it's probably easier to find out because many times they just post the numbers. A buddy of mine said, oh yeah, if you want to make $17 an hour these days, do a night shift at McDonald's. Okay, well, when I worked at McDonald's way back in high school, nothing close to that. Even at McDonald's 3 years ago, nothing close to that. Compensation has changed dramatically. So even if you were in the market 2 years ago, landed, and now you're in the market again, as I mentioned earlier, it's a different market. Salaries, Harry and I have talked about some just crazy offers for senior executives that have taken place in order to retain those people in this period of the Great Resignation. However, not so fast, my friend. Now we're talking about the big R word of recession, and companies are starting to pull back, close, or just sit on open requisitions. They're just saying, let's just not move so fast. When I was at United Health Group, my job, before I got into the culture job, I was the chief administrative officer for one of our divisions. And I had human resources that reported to me. And my hand was on the faucet of the requisitions. And I could turn them on or I could turn them off. Or we could just simply put them on hold because we didn't want to lay off people, right? It's understandable if people are a little nervous, they're going, I'd rather close an open requisition than hire that person and later on have to fire somebody else. That just makes sense. So all of those things will play a factor in what your compensation level is. If you go to the analogy of buying a home, well, any of you have bought a home in the last 2 years, the market has just been crazy about going up, 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 up. Oh, but what happened in the month of July? Month of July, price appreciation fell for the biggest drop in the last 10 years. Still, it's a high appreciation for this year, but something has shifted. Well, now, if you were searching for a home, I don't know that I would go above the asking price. Like you may have had to do 3 months ago, where I had a friend who put in a bid on a house and they had 5 offers within 24 hours, 4 of which were over the asking price. Well, in today's environment, it might be a little bit different. All of these things make it very worthwhile. And not just from a due diligence and feeling good about yourself, but from a dollar and cents perspective. You want to be out there networking, finding out as much as you can. You want to get online and start to look perhaps at some of these salaries. Now, the huge caveat I want to throw out whenever you're looking online We all know that everything online is not necessarily true. The same is true for every one of these websites. Now, I'm not suggesting the Bureau of Labor and Statistics or the Department of Labor, those top two bullets on the left, are lying to you. I'm not saying that, but that data is trailing data. So things can change very quickly. It may start to shift. But if you start to look at what a controller at a public company makes, using my prior example, or let's go even, you're going to be a nurse, and let's look at what a nurse makes. You're going to start to find a range that starts to develop, or it'll help you gauge what those numbers are. If you've not done this step, I'd highly recommend it. It's less awkward perhaps, or you may feel more comfortable just sitting there looking through the web versus having conversations to try to extract that information. It's worthwhile, and you start to get a gauge, right? So there are some websites, and I'm sure there's others that are out there to check out. Just know that not everything that's out there is necessarily truthful. Another one, for example, is Glassdoor, or Indeed may post some information, and it could be all over the map. All right, so going back to number one, number two, number three, you've got to give them a number up front. You've got to pass go to get $200. What is it that you should give them? You may not know exactly what you want. I want to make $70,000. Okay, well, let's define that range. So starting at the top, W-2s don't lie. Inevitably, a question that you're asked on many applications or by many recruiters is, what did you make last year? Well, that shouldn't cause a lot of consternation. I found it does, because someone goes, well, I had this magnificent year. I don't want to be overpriced. Hey, it is what it is. Give them the number. So let's say that the company did well, you did well, you're a nurse, and let's say that you made $75,000. Okay, let's start to jot some numbers. So number one is 75,000. I'm going to jot them myself so I don't forget them. Because of the work you did in step number 5, when you said, well, this is what I need to pay for my house, to pay for my kids' education, to pay for food. I need, let's say, $50,000 for number 2. Number 3, I'm a nurse. I made 75 with number 1. I need 50. Man, if somebody offered me 85,000, that would just be, whew, I'd be all over the top. That's a great number. Okay, but I recognize someone's not there just to make my dreams come true. If I could get comfortable, and I know that I made, I mean, 75 is just a number that's not going to happen. I think 70 is a number that I could feel very comfortable with. And then you come to number 5, what's the market reality? Through the previous steps of talking to other people and looking online, you go, man, I've seen a lot of numbers around 65,000. Okay, so to quick recap, I've got 75,000 for number 1, 50 for number 2, 85 for number 3, 70 for number 4, and 65. I have created a range of 50 to 85. Okay, now that's a broad range. Typically, I like to recommend a range of about 20%. I'm not going to embarrass myself with the math right now, but if you looked at 50 and 85 and you said, I want to make sure that that's within a 20% range, maybe you go up to 60 to 72, right? And you're going to have a number within there that a range that you're going to feel comfortable with, that you're able to then submit to pass go and keep moving through the process, right? So those 5 numbers, I have found many times people don't know those numbers and they're just pulling a number out of the air. Not the best process, everybody. Go through a little bit of logic, do some homework. You're going to feel much better about what you're able to negotiate toward when you receive that offer. So now let's get to the end. And this is maybe what most of you, or many of you, joined this presentation for is, okay, Dave, that's all good, but I got an offer. I wanted to be able to negotiate a better offer. I want to get the maximum money that I could. I'd say, okay, again, go through steps 1 through 7, but now we've arrived here. Whenever you receive an offer, unless it's for an hourly position where the number is whatever it is, I would never accept the offer as initially offered. Okay. I would simply say, wow, thank you so much for this offer. I am so excited. I am so grateful for this offer. When would I need to let you know my answer? I'd like to talk about it with my spouse, my significant other. I have a coach. I have a best friend. I'd really like to talk this over with someone and think about it and take a little time. 99% of the companies will say no problem and they'll give you a date. Okay, there may be the 1% that really presses in. Again, if you've been paying attention along the way, you're going to have a feel for how desperate they are to get this position filled. Now, most companies, when they're trying to fill a position, they want you to start as quickly as possible. That position has been open for a while. That work has been shifted to other people. Whatever is taking place, there's a reason that position is out there. But you've been through this long process. Take a couple days to sleep on it, pray about it, get some wise counsel from other people. And to that end, I would say, don't accept the offer as is. Now, through that time, you've been building a relationship. You've been trying to learn more about the company. Do you really want to, if you put yourself in the position of a buyer of a product, do you really want to buy the product without knowing more? So the way I have found that is a very useful way to go through a salary negotiation. After you get a couple days, you get some counsel and you develop some questions. You know they want something back within a couple days. Let's say, I'm going to start to ask some questions. Well, what do you mean ask some final questions? I've never met anyone that's been through the interview process that shouldn't have more questions about the people and the organizations that they're joining. I worked at United Health Group for close to 16 years. I still had questions about United Health Group. For people that have never stepped foot inside the organization, they've been through a 30-minute screening, they've been through 4 hours of interviewing, they may have actually met the team members. There's still a lot you don't know. So get some other questions in order, so from your own perspective, you're able to go through due process. From their perspective, you're also subtly going after the relationship side. You're demonstrating how worthwhile you are to want to pursue. They obviously want you, or they would not have made an offer to you. But do they love you? Do they gotta have you? So by you asking some questions, that's going to demonstrate to them, my goodness, those are good questions. And you're going to get some counsel, right, from a Harry Urschel at Crossroads, or Skip Nelson at Crossroads, or me, to brainstorm with you about what those questions could be. You go through that process, and through that, you're also learning some things, and you're going to ask some questions, also not just about compensation, we're coming to that, but just what it's like to work there. Because again, you don't know everything that there is to know. Here's a hot topic for today. Let's talk about remote work. Where is that organization from bringing people fully back into the office, or doing some hybrid, or going remote? A lot of them think they've arrived at a conclusion, but it's still a very fluid process. So just to ask more about that, right? So there's a number of things about a strategy of a business, the work environment, the culture. I could spend a couple hours talking with you about culture of the organization and what I would suggest you may not know, going to those blogs for June and July if you want to look on our website. There's a lot to know outside of compensation. But there's also a lot people don't know usually, even when they receive an offer. My daughter just started a job with a large financial institution. She lives down in Houston. So of course, she and I were talking about that. And as she went through the process, more and more was uncovered after the offer was made. Here's a few examples, okay? A lot of people forget the main bullet point of number 2, future raises. They don't even know what the raise cycle is. Well, if you accepted an offer at United Health Group with less than 3 months, our raise cycle was 12/31. If you started in October 15th of the prior year, you'd go 14 months before you'd get a raise, right? Well, it's just good to know that. And it also may help you from a negotiation perspective. A lot of people don't know the severance provisions. Well, what happens if things don't work out? When my daughter started this new job, true story, at the end of June, she had gone through an extensive interviewing process. She had found that she was going to have 3 bosses in the matrix organization of this large financial institution. She flew up here from Houston with our new granddaughter, our first granddaughter. So we got to babysit, my wife and I. Well, my wife did most of the babysitting. I got to chime in. But she went to New York City for 3 days because they were having a team meeting that they had once a year. At that team meeting, I mean, she literally started the day that she showed up in New York City for this team meeting. She was told that one of the 3 bosses was being moved to a different area, and here was her new 3rd boss. She had never even met the guy before, right? Things changed. Well, let's say things didn't go well with boss number 3, and Nicole had to terminate a termination of the job at the end of August. Well, it'd be useful to know what that severance provision was, right? Which she did check out. But a lot of people are so hesitant to ask pressing questions that do have financial ramifications. Remember, it takes 2 to tango. You need to come to a conclusion here. And that's where you want to do some of these things that I mentioned in the form of compensation. I remember when I started at United Health Group, I was coming from Los Angeles to Minnesota. I grew up in Kansas, so I was familiar with changes in weather, but nothing like Minnesota. And they were showing me where you would park. And I noticed that the guy that was recruiting me would drive over to a certain area of the parking structure, press a button, and a door opened, and they had covered, heated parking. I turned to my friend Bob, who was also going to be my boss, and I said, Bob, if you guys decide to move forward, one of the most important things to me is this covered parking. I do not want to walk through snow, and it all worked out. But just to know these things and to talk about these things, many people forget about them because they're so focused on the dollar amount of compensation. They leave out some things that are very important to them. Secretarial support is another one. I mean, more and more companies are leveraging a secretary, an executive assistant, in different ways than they did years and years ago. It may be 2 people on one executive assistant. It may be 4, which was standard for United Health Group. It may be 17 when you're dealing with remote workers, also at United Health Group. So you want to ask the question, what kind of support you're going to get? What's that worth to you? You can value that. Anyway, you want to get it in writing. You want to be able to start moving. So once you've received the offer, you've been grateful for the offer, you've gotten some counsel, you've gone back to them with questions, both on the business and the strategy and the culture, and some financial, now's the time that you can summarize and say, would you consider this? Would you consider that? If you have found that the base salary that they're offering is near the low end of your range, well, okay, you gave them a range. If they're within that range, you're not obligated to accept it, but you shouldn't be surprised by it within the range. But it also doesn't mean you can't negotiate for something more. So let's go back to my nurse example. Let's say I landed on that range of 60 to 72, and they gave me an offer of 65. Well, now I'm starting to think, well, man, I made 75, and I know I told myself that was just a one-time shot, but I still liked 75. I'm now at 65 as an offer. I wonder if they'd go to 68. Well, you won't know till you ask them. So you may say, I'm wondering if we might be able to do something on base compensation. And you need to give them rationale, not just because you feel like it's a good number, but because you've done your homework on the 5 numbers, you've done the other steps, you're able to give them some logic as to why you deserve or warrant that particular pay. Now, they're going to have a position that they're going to take as to why they make an offer at 65. What I would suggest, however, is most salaried positions, there's wiggle room. And wouldn't you like to get a little bit of wiggle? Going back to my daughter, Nicole, she was made an offer. It's a good offer. It was within the range. We went through this process and she said, I think I'm worth more. I think based on what I've said, and she made a little case for it, they bumped her 10 grand. Just like that, with the recruiter. All she had to do was ask. Well, if she had just eagerly accepted the offer because she was so desperate to get something, she would have missed out on, in this case, real story, 10 grand of base compensation. Now, of course, I said, well, Nicole, if they were that easy to get 10 grand, maybe they'll go another 10 grand. So we schemed and went through all these other things. Nope, nothing else. They held firm, but she can start there feeling comfortable that she went through the right due process. She got the maximum that they were willing to pay and she felt comfortable with it. Just a few more things and we're gonna wrap up here. Health benefits are huge. We're all getting older, and as we get older, health benefits change. If you're with kids, hey, you need coverage for those kids, all these other things, you should be aware of the health benefits side of things as part of the overall compensation. And it's not something that generally most companies or people talk about. They don't talk about the deductible. It's a high deductible plan. They don't talk about a disease that you may have. You may need insulin shots. You have diabetes. You need certain treatments. Okay, pre-existing conditions. All of those things are going to affect your bottom line. So for you to understand that is another host of questions that are very rational, that a recruiter or a hiring manager should be able to answer. Okay, now I'm not suggesting you the benefit plan summary and you go through the whole thing and ask them on page 36 on paragraph 4. No, but just some basic questions so you understand what is the out-of-pocket cost going to be for you. Because moving from one company to company number 1 to company number 2, it could be a dramatic difference. It could eat up everything, or that could add to your rationale for why you're asking for a base level compensation adjustment. Hopefully that makes sense. Financial benefits are another one. At United Health Group at the time, the executive savings plan had a threshold of you had to make $150,000 in order to get access to the executive savings plan. Well, let's say you were at that level, but I had made you an offer of 148 grand. Well, if you never asked about, other financial benefits at United Health Group and never even knew about the executive savings plan, you would have missed out on 6% that the company was able to fund. Just for asking the question. Well, hey, do you think you could bump me to 150? I understand there's an executive savings plan. I'd sure like to be able to take advantage of that. And because you go through and you build the case for it. It's not just because, well, I just want more money. There's a case that you've been able to build for that. The more questions you ask, the more homework you've done, the more investigation, and you would find out about an executive savings plan from your networking. If you're at that level of executive, you're saying, well, what deferred compensation exists? How do you treat bonuses? What equity may be out there? All of those things are perspectives that can affect your bottom line. Let's say you're currently at a position. I think this is my last, it's my last slide. Asking for a raise. Hopefully you've gathered through this presentation, there needs to be logic for it. It can't be just because I feel like it. But as you are looking at in the midst of the Great Resignation, which may be tapering off a bit, if you've seen colleagues leave for other positions and you kind of get a gauge from them that they're leaving for a lot more money, it might be a good time to say, hey, we've lost 4 out of 10 people from my department. I know they've all left for 20% more. I think I'm worth this. And you can structure that. That's a longer conversation about how to be polite but persistent, and also laying the groundwork for the future raise or the future offer. So one last thing that applies to both this slide and the previous slides of negotiating for a raise or negotiating for a higher offer. Even if you've done all the homework and you decide not to go through and press for an increase in base or an increase in bonus, or I need something different, or a signing bonus, just to go through and get the information is worthwhile. Also, by you going through that process and asking them good questions, guess what you're doing? You're laying the groundwork that you expect to be paid fairly and equitably. So when raise time does come, your boss will remember the process that you've been through, even if you didn't press in. But they know that, hey, I expect to be paid fairly for the value that I'm adding. So when the raise process comes through, you've laid the groundwork that you have expectations that need to be met. My daughter Nicole didn't get the second round of increases. It's okay, but she laid the groundwork. There are some very clear expectations. And guess what? Then she followed it up with an email after she started saying, hey, just a quick recap of our conversation. It's very clear to them what she's looking for. Now, a lot can change between now and the end of the year when they do their salary. It doesn't mean you can't change your mind. But if you miss that opportunity, you've missed that opportunity. And I'm hopeful that as what you're taking away here is there is a long process that should be used for compensation, for you to bring to yourself and your family the most that a company can afford to pay you, and also to manage your own expectations about what a company may pay for you. So with that, I'm going to stop the slide presentation and turn it back over to Skip or Harry. And if we have some time, I'll leave it up to their judgment whether we have enough time for any chat questions or not.
Wow. Thank you, Dave. That was amazing. I was taking notes. I'm not even looking, but man, that's just incredible information. So thank you. Thank you for sharing
Pleasure to be here.
and insight. Any questions that you want to address, Harry? I'm not seeing any.
People are welcome to add their questions to the chat box.
Yeah, if any come in, we'll be happy to ask them. And while we're at it, anybody that's joining us from outside of Minnesota, we're always interested to hear where people are joining us from. So if you're not from Minnesota and you are joining us this morning, hearing my voice, pop in the chat box where you're joining us from. Colorado's coming in. Sheila, wonderful. Welcome from Colorado, the Mile High state. So great to see. It's amazing. We've had people from all over the world. Here's a question from Jake. How do we know when to walk away from an offer? That's a good question.
It's a great question. As you've gone through the process, Jake, you're going to have a feel for whether something either smells fishy or doesn't quite land right with you. And particularly, this is why to ask for a couple days to get some wise counsel, to talk to your spouse, significant other, to get some other people's input. Because if you get the same puzzled look from everyone when you talk about this, odds are you're getting some clues that maybe it's not quite right. And also, if as they respond to those questions that I've been posing or suggesting you pose, you're going to get a gauge of how they treat you along the way. And if they are abrupt and curt and dismissive, perhaps, of you and your questions, well, guess what they're going to be like when you're an employee? If this is the way they are when they're trying to get you, once they have you, again, if you miss the opportunity, you miss the opportunity. So if the numbers don't add up, if you don't have the peace through prayer and conversation with others, those are clear signals to me that something's not quite right and you should potentially walk away.
Awesome. Thank you. We have another question from Dan. Hello. Good morning, Dan. Can you please address again appropriate and wise responses to the compensation needs in the first conversation?
Sure. So if the recruiter is saying, I'd really like to get what range you're looking for, you need to give them a range, right? They're not, a good recruiter will not back off. They will not just take a dismissive answer from you as an answer. They will get an answer. So you need to be prepared. But let's say that they want to continue to press you, but no, what exactly are you looking for? I got your range of 60 to 72, but would you accept 64? Would you accept 69? To me, the polite answer is, I appreciate that question and I'd be more than happy to give a response. However, I feel like there's so much that I don't know about the role right now and the scope and responsibilities of the role, along with the opportunity for the value that I may have to contribute, that I think it's just a bit premature to talk about that at this time. Now, if they walk away from that, you've dodged a bullet, okay? Because again, if they're not willing to entertain a very polite answer, that just to me sends a very wrong signal. And Harry, I'd value your opinion on this, but I would say 99% of the recruiters or hiring managers are going to accept that answer and move on from pressing in for a detail. But I'd love to hear, Harry, your experience as a recruiter with that.
I think maybe you touched on it, but a recruiter that presents a candidate to a hiring manager, and then they can't hire the person at the end of the process because the salary range doesn't match up, that recruiter is going to have a black mark in the mind of that hiring manager, right? And so they have to get that answer up front, and they're not going to back off. But giving a range is perfectly acceptable. The biggest mistake I think many people make on that is they give a bottom number that they're really not able to accept. They give it low in order to stay in the process. But then if the offer comes in at that bottom range and you can't accept it, you've really lost credibility to negotiate from that point. You told them that this is an acceptable range.
Right. Thank you. Other questions that may be out there? Skip, you're on.
Question from Mark. If you have a long gap since your previous professional position, how can you address this up front and move forward?
Yeah, a good recruiter will obviously want to know what's going on. Very similar to compensation, you need to have a logical answer, right? If you said, well, I felt like taking the summer off to spend time with my family, that's an acceptable answer. That's a very truthful answer. If you said, well, I just felt like watching Netflix, binge on Netflix and eating Cheetos for a while, not the best answer, right? But most people have a very acceptable reason for the gap. So I would just work through, and this is where practicing your answers to this, which we do in Crossroads small groups, proves to be a useful process. I mean, if you were fired for performance from your employer and you can't seem to land a job, or you have a lot of gaps in your employment, I mean, you last, 8 weeks at one job and 7 months in another, and then you get a 2-year stretch, well, then you need to have an answer for that. And there are ways to go through, rarely without practice, but there are ways to make an answer sound good and acceptable to a recruiter, to keep you moving in a process, but rarely without practicing in a difficult situation, including when you have a long gap.
Great. Another question from John. What if you need more in on multiple fronts and they don't offer any wiggle? Do you ask to go over their heads to the hiring manager? What is the best way to push for more variable if they won't wiggle on base?
Yep, great question. So sometimes, depending on the company, they look to the recruiter to handle all of the navigation with the candidate. As the candidate, you don't want that. You want the hiring manager. because the one that's going to be able to put the pressure is not necessarily the recruiter, it's the hiring manager. So that's why those questions after you receive the offer are so important. Most of which you'd say, I want to talk to the hiring manager about these questions. Well, how do they say no to that? No, the hiring manager is off limits. You cannot speak to the hiring manager. Well, then I don't want to accept your offer. Give me a break. Now, very logical how some companies have divided things up to where only the financial questions are answered by the recruiter. And that's absolutely what happened with this large institution that my daughter accepted the offer. She was going back and forth with the recruiter. She did talk to the hiring manager, and that hiring manager allowed pressure for her to get a higher offer. All right. But you're going to need to answer the question as to what you're going to have certain questions that only the hiring manager is going to be able to offer versus the recruiter.
Thank you. Great responses, my goodness, and great questions. Thank you all. I think that does it, other than John's question about how do I join a small group, and I will address that because we've got a ton of resources here at Minnesota Crossroads that I will run through. But thank you, Dave, for sharing your insights. Wonderful presentation, and we'll dive into the resources about what is offered through Crossroads, which you probably know a thing or two about.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, Dave. Let me share my screen with you, and we will go through resources. I will apologize in advance that with some childcare issues, I've got an assistant here, my 16-month-old Maisie. And so if you hear some squirming or something in the background, if they're screaming and crying, it could be me or her, probably her though. So just accept that, know where it's coming from. Yeah, you think that's funny. But I'm going to share my screen because, as I said, you're not in this alone. And Crossroads, that Dave chairs nationally, our local group at Minnesota Crossroads is run by Harry Urschel, whose voice you heard in the background, has phenomenal resources available to you in job transition. And so I'm going to share my screen and go through some of those resources that you have available to you. So let's see if we can get this to, there we go. So Minnesota Crossroads is headquartered when we're in person at Grace Church in Eden Prairie, but we also are operating through two other churches, Woodbury Lutheran and North Heights Lutheran in Arden Hills. Currently, everything we're doing is virtual, and so we're not at those locations, but we certainly are looking to get back there, hopefully sooner rather than later. The thing that you need to run, don't walk, to put www.mncrossroads.com in, go on the website, follow on LinkedIn. This is a phenomenal resource for you for information on what Crossroads has going on, events going on, resources, and jobs that are coming in all the time. And so it's something that you're going to want to be tied to and checking periodically. There, to John, I believe his question as far as small groups and stuff, there's ongoing opportunities for resource to help you in your job transition. A great networking group meets 9 to 11 every Thursday, so right after this meeting, run by Wes Tang and Wes Roper. Great networking group. And so you do sign up for this at the same page that you signed up for this event. And it's great. You get a roster, everybody's contact information, really help to hopefully plug you into companies that you've targeted in your job search. So it's a great networking group. We also have one-on-one coaching available. So again, on this site, you can sign up for one-on-one coaching. If you have questions about a resume to get reviewed, or if you want to do a mock interview, oh, God bless you. And or anything that you'd like some one-on-one activity, you can get that. There's coaches waiting to help you in that regard. We're also big believers in prayer, and there are people praying for you, even if you don't realize it, that are praying over this group. And if you have specific prayer requests, don't hesitate to reach out, give them to us, and we'd be more than happy to pray for them for you. The other thing, to getting to John's question specifically about the ongoing classes, we have an 8-week class for small group on literally every aspect of job transition. As you can see, literally anything that you might have questions about, all the critical elements of job transition are covered in this group. And they're starting every month. So sign up, get in. You'll be in with 4, 5, 6 other folks that'll move through. There's a leader of that group, a great resource, and fantastic information to help you on your journey. Again, as I mentioned, make sure you join the LinkedIn group. It's a great way to connect with other people in Minnesota Crossroads, and also get tied into the ongoing information, jobs, and things that come through. Another great resource. My gosh, this is a treasure chest of information. And we have a YouTube channel, MN Crossroads Career Network, and presentations that we have, fantastic presentations every month, of which Dave was today. And Dave's presentation, along with most of the others, are on the YouTube channel that you can watch anytime you want. So go through and just sift through them. You will find fantastic speakers and topics that will be really, really helpful in your job transition. Great, great resource. Also, I'm very proud of my company, Thrivent Financial, has been an ongoing supporter of Minnesota Crossroads for a long, long time. And in fact, asked me to put together some workshops that happen the first, second, and third Tuesday of the month, dealing with financial issues in job transition. So if you have questions about, how do you navigate this kind of unique time financially? We also talk about other things like how to secure retirement, steps to do that, and just market updates about this crazy, turbulent market that's going on, and what do we, what's going on, what do we see coming, all that stuff. So if that's of interest, you can also sign up on this very page that you signed up for this. As has been referenced, there are a lot of volunteers. Harry has put together an incredible team of people that volunteer to bring you Minnesota Crossroads. And it's people that do the coaching, that run the groups, that are there for you. And so, again, don't hesitate to reach out. There's a lot of people from every background you can imagine. Many of us have been through job transition ourselves. We know what you're going through and are here to help in your journey. Again, the 3 organizations that we're tied in with, if you don't have a church home, any of the organizations are all in person now, but also have online and streaming options. If you'd like, we feel that that's a big help, as has been referenced. We're not in this alone. God's got a plan. Don't keep it all on your shoulders. Let God take some of this off your shoulders, and it will make your process go a lot more smoothly and less stressful, I found. So those are the resources for Minnesota Crossroads that are on tap for you. We are thrilled that you joined us here this morning. And hopefully the information, gosh, it was phenomenal from Dave that you got some notes as far as compensation questions, which becomes a big issue. And so hopefully that's of help to you, and any other many resources that Minnesota Crossroads has for your job transition. We are here for you, so don't hesitate to reach out. It's been great having you. So on behalf of Maisie and me, we wish you wonderful success in your job transition, and hope to see you again next month at Minnesota Crossroads. Bye-bye.